Okay, so today we're going to focus on the book The Market Gardener, which is a great resource to learn how to succeed as a small scale organic vegetable grower. I highly recommend this book. You can buy it on a variety of platforms. It's listed in the syllabus. If you need more information, let me know. I have a copy of it. I used to make students buy it and read it, but I don't know. I don't like doing that. So um, I highly recommend it. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. Okay. So ultimately, the farmer who wrote this book recommends a biologically intensive approach. So it's a little bit permaculture, we'll say. So biointensive refers to a horticulture method in which growers maximize crop yields from a minimum area of land while seeking to preserve or improve the quality of the soil. It's mostly geared towards home gardening, but many of the practices can be useful in commercial production. And you can see here what their farm looks like. And I can tell you that maintaining this level of production takes a lot of work. But they're able to make a completely normal standard of living. I can't remember, but I want to say they make $70,000 a year. I may be wrong, but and this is their full-time job. This is what they do. So biointensive, in this instance, they used raised beds. Typically, crops are spaced according to tractor dimensions, which creates limitations. So they use permanent raised beds instead. So they have a large quantity of organic matter to begin with in order to create a rich and living soil. They add compost regularly and limit turning of the soil to just the surface. They use a broad fork when disturbing the soil in order to create loose, fertile soil to encourage roots to grow downward instead of sideways. And the next time we're out at the farm, I will show you our broad fork and how it is used. Biointensive crop spacing. So they space crops so their leaves touch when they reach 3/4 of their full size. So at maturity, their foliage will cover the growing area and create a living mulch. Closely spacing the crops also produces higher yields and cuts down on the amount of weeding required. You really basically ultimately only have to weed these crops until they reach about 3/4 mature size. And then they provide their own weed control by blocking out photosynthesis of other um, plants trying to grow in between. So you're maximizing your growing space by using something called successive harvesting techniques. So you determine how much time each crop spends in the garden, and you plant seedlings so that the crops have already harvested, so the crops that are already harvested are quickly replaced by new ones. This leads to multiple harvests each season in the same garden space. So ultimately, so they minimize startup costs. They start small and grow intensively. Some items can be purchased secondhand, others are a little harder and aren't needed until further down the road. So some tools may not seem necessary, but they are efficient and can pay for themselves quickly. So for example, using a seeder instead of having people hand seed like we did can be a lot more efficient. Some countries have startup farmer assistance programs that can help out with financing for agriculture equipment, and that includes the United States. We have the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service, known as the USDA NRCS, and they have startup grants for starting farmers, and they're usually released this time of year, and you would work with a university partner sometimes. Sometimes you don't have to have a university partner. So some startup costs for market gardening. 25 by 100-foot greenhouse can be $11,000. Two-wheeled tractor with accessories can be $8,500. Two hoop houses that are 15 by 100 foot, 7 grand. A cold room, this is where you would store your vegetables, would be about $4,000. An irrigation system, $3,000. Furnace to heat the greenhouse can be a little over $1,000. A flame weeder, I have one of these. They are the best thing ever. 10 out of 10 would recommend. Can be $600. I actually got mine for, I think it was $200. So it depends on the kind of flame weeder you get. If it's an attachment to your tractor, it's going to be significantly more expensive than one that you wheel around, which of course you wouldn't want one that you wheel around if you're working on 10 acres, but if you're working in a small garden like I am, one that you wheel around is just fine. It's literally like on a dolly. It's a propane tank like you would use for a grill, and I got a special attachment with a long nozzle with some turn switches, and I use a flint to light it. And it's a lot of fun because I'm pyro. All right, so indoor seating equipment, about $600. Hose and wheel hoe, $600. These make it easier to weed. A broad fork, about $200. Seeders, $300. Rakes, shovels, spades, wheelbarrow, all about $200. Actually, I would say that their estimate for rake, shovel, spades, and a wheelbarrow is very low. A wheelbarrow itself can be $200. Um, so I would increase that. Floating row cover, anti-insect netting and hoops, $600. A sprayer, about $100 for a good one. Um, Harvest buckets, scales, and other equipment, $300, and electric fencing, about $500. In total, your startup costs to run your operation at the scale that they're running theirs is about $39,000. It's a pretty big investment. Um, but if you're really doing this full time as a business, then that's what you can expect to pay to start up a business. So, minimizing production costs, revenue minus expenses is what are going to ultimately be your profit. People get into organic farming for different reasons, but at the end of the day, it is a business and you have to remember that. So, scaling up your operation means eventually you're going to up your production and sales. Until then, you're going to operate at your lowest, well, you're always going to operate at your lowest cost. You want to limit your dependence on outside labor to save money. But that means that it's going to be really hard for you to have another 9 to 5 job because truly, if you are doing this as a business, you're doing this on multiple acres and it's a 9 to 5 job. It really is. Direct selling is one of the best ways to go. Farmers markets and community shared agriculture are great programs for direct selling. Citizens are essentially taking back the agriculture economy with these moves, and it's a wonderful opportunity for new farmers. So, farmers markets, pluses and minuses. Pluses are that it's a great way to get your name out in the local community, and it's a great way for citizens to see you, to know you. It's a fantastic marketing opportunity. Most farmers markets are very well attended. There's one at Minnetrista every Saturday. I think it might be shutting down for winter production, and then they only do it the first Saturday of every month. But long story short, most of the farmers markets are very well attended, so it's a great way to start up your business. Community shared agriculture is basically a program where you are selling a share of produce to be provided weekly for a set number of months, and you get payment in advance. So, a lot of times, what this looks like is maybe somebody offers you 5 pounds of vegetables that you pick up every Friday at X location for 3 months, and they tell you what they're going to be growing that season. So you have a general idea of what you're going to be getting each week for the next month or for the next 3 months. And you would pay in advance for that share. You're basically investing in the farmer, and the farmer is promising you a product in return. They're wonderful programs. I would 10 out of 10 recommend them. The hard part as a college student in doing these is that a lot of times it's hard for you to come up with that money up front. There are some share programs that allow you to pay as you go, but those are pretty rare because it's a contract with the farmer. You are ensuring the farmer they're getting paid because they could just sell all these vegetables to an aggregated economy like the Food Hub or Walmart or something like that. But instead, they're choosing to sell it to you. And so they're trying to make a contract with you where you are required to pay. So, anyways, long story short, even though it's hard to come up with the money up front for a college student, it ends up being cheaper than buying vegetables from the grocery store. Although a lot of times you will end up with things that you might not be comfortable or used to cooking. So make sure you read what they're going to be providing you. But I personally really loved doing the community shared agriculture thing when I could in college, and I do continue to support that. In fact, I'm in talks with a local farmer who does a CSA, and we're going to be visiting their farm in Muncie later this month. I will give you more information on that later. All right, so adding value to your crops. For example, leaving the leaves on the carrots once they go to market indicates freshness. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than a bunch of carrots that still has their greens on them tied together. It's all about how you market your produce, essentially, right? People will pay more for those kinds of carrots because in their mind, it looks like it came fresh out of the ground. It looks beautiful. Of course, if the greens are wilted and nasty looking, that diminishes your marketing ability. So you want to prioritize the most profitable crops. So grow whatever you want the first year, but make sure you maintain records on how they sell so that you can really hone in what does well. So the first year that we had the farm, I had a grant that paid students to work out there. So people were a lot more motivated to be there all the time. So we grew 179 varietals in the high tunnel. It was packed. It was amazing. Um, we ultimately found out that the things that sell the best were herbs. There was almost no one bringing herbs like basil, rosemary, lavender, dill, all of those kinds of things to the farmers market in Minnetrista. Those just they weren't really there, so they sold really, really well. So that's what we kind of decided we would go with in future years if we had a steady labor force. Um, Freshness and quality is ultimately the most important. Finding the right site. So if you're in the lookout for a mini farm, okay, to kind of build this dream, then your climate and your microclimate are going to be very important. This is a determining factor that influences crop growth. Okay, so let's say you wanted to be a pineapple farmer. Indiana would not be the place for you to be a pineapple farmer, all right, because the climate here isn't for pineapples. But that doesn't mean that we can't grow quite a bit of other things throughout the seasons that allow for warmth. It's just pineapples aren't a good option for here. So we're located in Indiana, where the annual average precipitation at my house, for example, is anywhere from 37 to 39 inches. In Muncie, uh, it looks about the same as that. Um, let's see. We also have a plant hardiness zone map. Muncie is a part of the 6A plant hardiness zone. My farm is located in I'm sorry, 5B. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't actually see what that says, but I think it says 5B. So anyways, wherever you want to buy your farm, what you want to do is Google agroclimatic maps for your area of interest, and that's how you can find out this information. That will allow you to figure out what varietals you can grow around what time of year. So you can extend your growing season using a high tunnel or a hoop house or row covers. And in some instances, you can do both of these at the same time. So you can have a high tunnel in which you do row covers or what are called cold frame beds within the high tunnel. And it's like you're double, triple insulating it. And we did that one year and we were actually able to grow all year round doing that. It was very interesting. It was actually super cool. I would love to get back to the point where I have enough students who want to work out there full time to do that again because it was amazing. So market access becomes important in your planning. You have to think about the market you're growing for. So what is the demand for organic vegetables? What is the number of growers in the area? I mean, is there an actual demand for organic? Because a lot of people in the Minnetrista farmers market, there's only a handful of people who are certified organic because it's so expensive. Everyone else basically uh, advertises themselves as not organic, but not conventional either. They call themselves naturally grown, um, natural growers, that kind of thing. So if there is not a demand for organic certification in your area, if people will buy your produce if you tell them you grow it naturally without using synthetic fertilizers or using synthetic um, pesticides, sometimes that's enough for producers. So make sure you do the market research to figure these kinds of things out. Save yourself the money if you don't need to do the organic certification. So what are you going to grow? What cells in your area that can be grown with your production system? What hasn't been sold that is needed? What specialty crops would be a hit? For example, what we found in Minnetrista was that people were like crazy excited when we brought basil as well as or I can't remember the name of the lettuce. I just had it. Sorry, I have pregnancy brain. Arugula, mm, no, not oregano. It's the peppery type of lettuce. ARUG, something like that. Yes, oh my gosh, I can't say the word, you guys. Like the pregnancy brain thing is real. This is weird. Arugula. That was hard. I'm glad we were all here to see this, witness this, be a part of this moment. Arugula. All right, arugula was what people were so crazy about at Minnetrista. Um, and we got our seeds from Johnny Seeds, which I highly recommend. They have really good seeds. They are a little bit more pricey, but they're worth it. So finding your specialty crops is important. And pricing your items right is also important. So one of the things that I noticed and that we would also do is you get to the market early, you set up, and then you look and see what other people are setting up. And what I always found interesting was I would see Amish kids walking around with a notebook, writing down everybody's prices, and then they would go back to their booth and then they would set their prices to be competitive with everybody else's. Because if you're selling arugula for $4 a pound and everybody else is selling it for $2 a pound, well, you better have some golden friggin' arugula because no one else is going to be buying it. They're going to be going to those other booths. So pricing your items becomes important. So growing space needed. You want it to be big enough to grow what you need, small enough that heavy machinery is not necessary. Bigger is not always better. It's oftentimes just more overwhelming and more work than it's worth. So start start small and then work into bigger areas. So soil quality. Yields are largely dependent on quality of soil in organic gardening. So ideally you want your soil to be loose, well drained, high in nutritional content. Loam is the best texture. I would so change my name to Dr. Loam if I could because it's the perfect soil texture for agriculture. You could build up soil fertility with composting. So one of the things that I'm doing right now is we at our farm, my mini farm, which I really should just have you guys all out here for a lab because we could like barbecue and make it super fun. We're nowhere near ready to like really show off our property yet because we have so much more pasture to build, but whatever, I'll still show you. So we have 33 ducks and ducks are nasty, man. They poop and they play in their water and they make a really big mess. So I can clean their pen every morning and by noon every day it'll look like nobody has cleaned it in 3 weeks. That's the way ducks are. They're gross. So what we do is we take all of that like nasty duck poop straw mixture and I'm spreading it out in the area where I'm going to garden next year so that it'll break down and turn into really awesome compost. And so you can build up soil fertility with composting things like that. And so that's kind of a permaculture principle, taking from one entity and recycling those nutrients into another. And one of those videos that I posted, it was the last video that I posted last week. They did the same thing with their ducks. I found that farm in Australia to be amazing. If you watch none of those videos, please watch the last one. They were so cool. And their Australian accents, I mean, does it get better? It doesn't. It doesn't get better. I love the accents. I live for them. Anyway, yeah, it was so cool. Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate you. All right, so topography. So ideally you have a gently sloping, less than 5% south facing slope with no depressions. Okay, so we essentially knocked it out of the park with our farm. This will affect how well soil drains and how fast it can be planted. Topography is an unchangeable feature, right? So yeah, you could probably bring in like 30 tons of soils and reshape your land, but that's going to be insanely expensive, okay? You don't have the money to do that, I promise you. It's so expensive to try to change topography. All right, so like it's just not a thing. People don't do that. So Drainage becomes really important. You definitely want to look up the soil survey for the soils on the area that you plan on purchasing for farming, because if it's waterlogged, you're going to have to install some really expensive tile drainage to manage it. If it's well drained, thumbs up, my friend, thumbs up. So this is a tile drainage system or a sediment basin in some instances. Like in this instance, they have a sediment basin that drains out into tile drainage. But anyways, so ultimately, tile drainage lowers the water table. It basically provides a layer underneath the soil that allows water to go into and get out of the way so that you don't have waterlogged soils. And this basically allows you to essentially do what you need to do. So what we kind of plan on doing, because the drainage where we're at isn't bad, but we do have a need for a pond for our ducks. Like right now, they have a bunch of kiddie pools that the livestock guardian dog keeps chewing, and then I have to fix them and then fill them with water. And then 3 days later, he figures it out, and I find the pool, out in the middle of the field somewhere with a big old hole chewed in it. Or sometimes I'll actually see him like flipping them around. He's such an asshole, but I love him all the same. Anyways, so that's our pool problem. So ultimately, another way to lower the actual water table is what you see a lot along fields in Indiana are drainage ditches, right? So what we want, not necessarily is a drainage ditch, but a drainage area that lowers the water table. That way we don't have to tile drain. So we set our barn up right next to our garden so that it's easy for us to take the duck slop and put it into the garden for composting. And at the same time, it's not far from where we would put the ducks' pond or drainage ditch that they can get in, because ducks actually have to clean their sinuses every day with water, which is why you see them like bobbing and weaving in water. They're actually cleaning out their sinuses. And if they don't do that, they get really sick. So they have to have water, access to water. And that's why they make such a mess literally everywhere. So they this would be the ultimate efficient system for us, right? And we would obviously have to like dredge out the ditch or pond eventually, and all of that like duck schmutz in the bottom would be fantastic fertilizer. So access to water. Plants depend on water, right? So you want to remember there are water requirements for vegetables to be sold as well. So you have to have every state has different laws, but ultimately the Obama administration also passed laws that are required for everyone to meet, in terms of washing your vegetables with safe water. So you have to test your water every year that you're using to wash your vegetables that you take out of your garden. Um, and you also have to be able to measure the temperature on it. For example, if you're washing tomatoes, there's a certain temperature required so that the tomatoes don't suck in the water and grow listeria. So there's all kinds of little fine details. And Purdue does a really good food safety lecture, and you can get certified in food safety. It's not expensive. It's like a 1 day training. They give you this giant binder. It's really well done. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend that you go to the Indiana Small Farms Conference that Purdue puts on and do the training. Um, so in addition to watering the plants, you have to wash the vegetables before you sell them, and there's legal requirements around that. So infrastructure. Additional resources and spaces needed to help a garden prosper include electricity for your barn. So um, luckily, we already had electricity in the barn when we bought it, but it definitely needs upgraded. Some of it looks pretty shady. Um, so we can turn on lights, and on when we first get babies, we keep them under heat lamps. But heat lamps can be really dangerous. So I'll show you what we do to modify our heat lamps to make them safe, because a lot of people lose their barns to heat lamp fires. Um, and you'd be surprised that in winter, most animals actually don't need provided heat. And we'll talk about that as well when we get into the animal chapter and when I have you out here to see a little bit of what we're doing. I've only lived here for a year, so having that electricity was super helpful, because in the first year that you are developing your infrastructure, it's expensive. We had to move water several places to make sure we had water for our garden as well as for our animals. And we did most of it ourselves to save money. And let me tell you, digging down past the frost line to put in hydrants is rough. There was so much we had to YouTube and learn. And honestly, one of the hydrants took us like 3 months. It was rough. Anyways, so you want to make sure that you have accommodated for the need of electricity and running water, etc. Essential infrastructure. The other thing about infrastructure that we learned was even though we had a barn, it had really serious roof issues. So we had to, pay somebody to come out and patch the roof because it wasn't the kind of roof that is a metal roof. It's very, very steep and it's very, very high. We didn't have what we needed to fix it. Also, barn doors. Our barn didn't have barn doors. Animals need to be protected from wind and snow and rain, so we needed barn doors that closed, and we're still trying to get our contractor to finish them. That's another story. Things to consider. The site already has a farm building. 10 out of 10 would recommend that it already has a farm building. Barns are very expensive to build. Very expensive to build. It's easier to get an old barn that has good structure and like re-side it or reframe it I'm sorry, re-roof it than it is to build a completely new barn. But of course, if the barn on a site is like falling down, that's a waste of money. There's no rehabbing that. You're gonna have to build a new barn. So there's like, there's a gray area there. You have to find that happy place. Um, uh, so there's no building, but you own the site, that's going to make things different for you. You're renting a site that doesn't have a building, then you're not going to want to put up a permanent building because you're basically increasing somebody else's land value and not your own. So any buildings that you would put up would be something that was temporary. And this is where high tunnels actually come in for animals. The Seven Sons are located not far from me. I'm trying to get a hold of them to get you guys access to their farms because they're phenomenal. If nothing happens, we'll at least watch a video because what they do is really interesting. They put up movable high tunnels in the winter to move their pasture raised chickens and pigs um, throughout their fields while still keeping them warm and protected. Pretty interesting and cool stuff. So, if you don't have a permanent building and you're renting a site, consider putting something in that's temporary that you can move with you when you move. But just know that high tunnels do have to be somehow put in the ground. So one of the options that you have for a site like that is to drive T-posts into the ground wherever there's a post and then connect it to the high tunnel. That way it stays in place. The high tunnel that's out at the farm is actually anchored 3 feet into the ground with concrete because the wind in Indiana will make it like a parasail. And I don't want my $10,000 high tunnel flying into the highway. So just some things to mention. Whether or not you have a driveway versus a dirt road becomes important, especially if there's heavy rains. There's really high clay soils here, so we wouldn't want driveways like go really far back onto a farm that hadn't been stoned. We lucked out. Uh, for starters, our property is longer than it is wide, so we're never very far from the road, but there is actually a stone driveway that leads to the barn that we found when we first bought this place. It hadn't been maintained for like a year or two, and the grass was super high. And when we mowed it, we found a road, like an actual stone road that led to the barn. So that was like a fantastic happy find because that saved us like $10,000. um, Okay, assessing potential pollution problems. So external pollutants are extensive nowadays, so you should always consider this in the back of your mind. So where we're getting ready to move our garden to is an old burn pile site, so I'm testing it for heavy metals in case they like burned aerosol cans there, things they shouldn't have done, which they probably absolutely did. Urban agriculture is susceptible to industrial contaminants. So if you're doing an urban garden project anywhere, in town, out of town, whatever, you have to test the soil for heavy metal contaminants. There have been so many issues in inner city urban gardens where they didn't do this and children got some kind of toxicity from an industrial contaminant that ended up on that site from previous industrial uses. There might not be any industry anywhere nearby, but there could have been 50 years ago. And as you all know, um, it's not something that's advertised when you're selling a lot. People aren't like, well, this used to be a glass factory, so you should probably be careful. No, they just want to sell their land. They're not going to tell you anything that's going to get them, any less of a sale. So Test your soil. Montreal community gardens were closed due to heavy metal contamination. Soil tests can be sent off to local testing labs. There are several local testing labs in this state. That's about $18. Worst case scenario for testing for a whole bunch of elements, maybe it's $70 to $100 for one test. But you could always do a composite test. Take 16 samples from the lot, mix them all up in a bucket, and fill up your sample bag with that conglomerate mix, and then you find out if there's anything bad on site. Designing the market garden. You want buildings and foot traffic to be taken into consideration. Faring between different buildings and gardens should be considered. Efficiency should be optimized, but also compaction from traffic and the utilization of space should be considered. You want to prep the working area for washing, handling, and storing of vegetables. Visit other farms to see how they design. I've been all over the surrounding states to see how other people designed their farms, not only for the student farm, but also for my family farm. And that will just allow you to see what designs work and don't work, or what designs you like and what designs you don't like, give you ideas. And remember, not everything's going to be how you want it to be in the first year. We've only lived here for a little over a year, and there is so much more we need to do. But even in this first year, we've already put in, we've already fixed the barn roof. We were able to move water. We were able to clear a garden area. We were able to start building the soil there. We were able to build one giant pasture that we intend to break into smaller pastures. We also intend to install multiple other pastures, but Rome isn't built in a day. So just know that you're going to have a grand design that you're going to work towards over time. Washing station setup. 2 tubs side by side with garden hose nozzles works just fine. Tubs can be about 36 inches high. You can build a basic shelter, or you can buy a portable canvas tent. It doesn't have to be fancy, it just needs to work. Okay, so you must have somewhere you can wash your hands with soap and water, hot water. You have to include a large table for weighing and bagging and boxing items. You need shelves for storage bags, bands, and other equipment. Having harvest containers should be easy to stack for storage. Lighting, of course, is going to be important. And then remember, you also have the requirements to test your water and maintain temperature of it. So keep that in mind. So here's some examples of washing stations that meet the minimum legal requirements. Now, this kind of a washing station isn't going to allow you to cut and bag lettuce, but it'd be fine for all the other types of vegetables. Here's some other examples of washing stations. There's one that's actually in a high tunnel. There's an open field washing station. There's a really nice washing station there on the bottom right. It's basically a commercial kitchen. Now that's ideal for larger operations that are going to be selling cut and processed vegetables, especially will require that. I've always had the dream of having canning classes. Josh Groover and I, Dr. Groover and I, have written multiple grants trying to get somebody to cover an expansive wash and pack for us and community canning classes, so that we can not only show people how to grow their own food, but to preserve it. Some of the lost ways that people don't really do as much anymore would be really helpful, especially for lower income families who are on food stamps and need to preserve some of that food for future use. So here's some more awesome washing stations. There's actually a mobile greenhouse and washing station at Butler University that Ball State built in an immersive learning class, and here it is. Super cool to see this in person. Would love something like this. All right, so some additional items to consider. Your standardized garden layout, and how you're going to rotate things through it. Remember, you don't want to grow the same things every year in the same place. And it can be problematic for pests to grow back-to-back vegetables that aren't compatible. So make sure you look into that. Locating greenhouse and hoop houses. Here, since we're above the 40-degree latitude, parallel, whatever, we essentially want to orientate, the orientation of our high tunnels, hoop houses, greenhouses should be east to west or west to east. If you're below 40 degrees, then it should be north to south. Basically, that essentially maximizes daylight for the house that you're using. All right. Buildings also cast shadows across each other, so pay attention to spacing if building multiple units. This is also necessary for snow removal. Don't forget, winter still requires maintenance of your buildings, especially if you're trying to grow year round. All right, some additional items. You're going to want to plan for protection from deer and other wildlife. You want to surround your area with very tall metal fencing. Windbreaks are very important. Having the proper irrigation setup will definitely affect your bed design. I went over this in the high tunnel, how it came with like this really expensive irrigation system that doesn't work for the way we want the bed set up. So that was a huge waste of money that I sincerely regret. It's especially important in high tunnels and covered beds. And you always want to take a look at the drainage in your high tunnel. All right, so minimum tillage and appropriate machinery. So you want, okay, so in this book, they suggest permanent raised beds. I will not always suggest permanent raised beds, but for permanent raised beds, I will say they do provide better drainage. The soil warms faster come springtime. There's no soil compaction because you're not continually going over them with machinery. You do get higher yields. There's a soil building factor that's really nice. You want to leave out the tractor wherever you can because tractors increase impaction. Having a two-wheel tractor or a walking tractor would be ideal, but it does require a lot more physical labor and strength. So for somebody like me who has an injured spine, I can no longer use a walking tractor. So I have set up the high tunnel in a way that allows me to use a tractor. So I had to forego compaction concerns for ease of use due to being old and broken. But just kind of keep that in mind. Things like that are important. So here's what a walking tractor looks like. It can be used to till or plant as well as to harvest. The broad fork um, is phenomenal. You basically stick it in the ground and kind of lean back a little to loosen the ground. Now you don't want to completely, this middle picture, they're kind of doing it a little wrong. They're pulling up the fork too much. But what you see on the left and right are ideal. Okay, you're putting it in the ground and you're wiggling it back and forth. And what this does is it creates some loosening of the soil for roots to find deep channels. So some other implements that are really useful are tarps and pre-crop ground cover. I use the ever-loving everything out of these. I always use tarps to plant into. You didn't see, there's a pile of tarps outside of the high tunnel, and I have always planted into them because weeding is especially hard for me since I hurt my back. And so this is my way of minimizing weeds. I literally put down giant tarps like this in my personal garden, and then I use my flame weeder to blow holes into them, and that's where I plant. And then very minimal weeding. So this also is a way to do no-till. You're covering the soil with an opaque tarp for a few weeks and um, in order to clean the surface of the beds without having to work the soil, which ultimately reduces weed pressure. This is called solarizing. So if you have a see-through tarp and you put it down, it warms up the soil from the sun and it makes all those weeds germinate and then they die. So you're basically like baking them to death in a giant clear tarp. Or what I do, because I'm lazy and that's just like one more step in my world, is I just put the black tarps down and then they don't get any photosynthesis. And then the only thing that, gets photosynthesis is where I blowtorch a hole and put in a plant. So here you can see a variety of vegetables grown into the black tarps. Of course, you're going to have to set up your irrigation specifically if you're irrigating. I never irrigate. My gardens are also never this big. So, you know, take it for what the scale is going to be. But this is basically what the application looks like. And this would greatly reduce your labor requirements. So if you are trying to do this on your own or with just one other person, a business partner or a life partner, um, these tarps are going to save you a lot of time weeding and are going to allow you to really intensify your efforts into the actual production aspects or harvesting, which is going to be a lot of effort. So, fertilizing organically, you want to make sure you're testing your soils, get pH, organic matter, mineral balances, make sure you're working with an agronomist. You want to definitely fertilize your heavy feeders with granulated poultry manure, about 1.6 gallons per bed. Compost, 5 wheelbarrows per bed are some rules of thumb. But again, this is going to depend on what your soil test tells you your soil needs versus the nutrients that are available in your compost. And you don't have to use poultry manure. You can also use horse manure, or you can use duck manure, or whatever manure you have readily available is a fantastic organics resource. However, remember that in order to qualify as as a labeled organic or certified organic resource, your manure has to come from an organic operation, meaning you are going to be getting manure from somebody who doesn't worm their animals, which I think is inhumane, who doesn't give them basically anything if they get sick that can then pass into their manure. Like all that stuff is banned in organic production. So your manure has to be free of those things. I have a really hard time with this because, well, you'll see when we get to the animal chapter, but I think animals should be well taken care of. And I don't think they're well taken care of if they're not vaccinated or treated when they're ill or dewormed. So we'll get there. You'll hear all about my opinions when we get to the animal chapter, but you are always welcome to have your own, and they may always differ from mine. I'm totally open-minded to you having a different opinion, and it does not affect my feelings at all towards you or whatever. Open-mindedness is important. More people need it. Onions. This includes leeks and green onions, about 2.6 gallons per bed of manure. Our lighter feeders, like our root vegetables, our salad mix, our lettuces, our greens, they only need about 2.1 gallons of poultry manure per bed. Peas and beans don't need fertilizer. They make their own because they're legumes. Garlic, you want to fertilize this in fall. It's a very heavy feeder, so it needs fertilized. You want to rotate your legumes with your heavy feeders to reduce fertilization needs. So for example, your peas and your beans can be followed by some of your heavier feeders the next year because they'll leave behind residual nitrogen for those heavy feeders. Fish and kelp fertilizers are also great resources. I utilize those quite extensively. They do smell absolutely terrible. I have some examples in the barn if you want to gag. Um, so here's some examples of those: C+, Neptune's Harvest. These are basically like composted fish sludge, and it smells exactly how it sounds. It's really disgusting. Here's a great example of chickadee doo-doo, basically poultry manure that has been composted. So you want to make sure you understand your crop requirements. So we know that there's a point at which adding fertilizer becomes economically beneficial. And there's also a point at which adding a certain amount of fertilizer is not needed anymore. Like you can over add fertilizer and then you're just wasting money. So we want to find that optimum point where we're not wasting money on excess fertilizer, but we're also not seeing reduced yields because we didn't add enough. So modern day agriculture science teaches about the needs of each individual crop. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium is an example of amending fertilizer requirements for different crops. And some use mathematical equations as a target. They basically offer something to aim for, even if they aren't perfect recommendations. Managing soil fertility. Your soil quality is an essential part of plant growth. So we want to make sure that we are managing soil and the ecological functions that it provides, and that we're feeding the microbes and giving them a variety of inputs, so that we're diversifying that population, because ultimately they're the ones that take everything, break it down, and make it into plant nutrients. So feeding them becomes important. Organic matter. When mineralized by organisms in the soil, organic matter makes nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and other micronutrients readily available to plants. Organic matter that is not mineralized basically builds up soil and contributes to structure. Organic matter is essentially fuel and habitat for soil organisms, and that biological activity in organic matter is tightly linked. And those organisms, again, are basically what are going to ultimately provide plants with all the nutrients they need. So we want to make sure they're happy. Soil testing can tell you how much organic matter is present in the soil. There's 3 ways to manage organic matter, including building your soil up by adding large initial organic amendments like peat moss to, to obtain high organic matter levels, but I will say peat moss is super, super expensive. You want to maintain soil fertility by making up for lost organic matter due to mineralization, tillage, erosion, etc. by composting, green manures, and crop residue. You want to ensure organic matter levels are not high due to low biological activity, which results from unbalanced pH or poorly drained soils. So again, management becomes an influx of all of these things that we've talked about. Here's a general map of the organic matter where it's highest in the US and where it's lowest. We're in a region where it's typically high, so that's a bonus. pH of 6 will inhibit microbial development and diminishes biological activity. So acidity can be corrected with liming material like wood ash or limestone. The ideal pH is between 6 and 7, so like a pH of 6.5. Once pH is adjusted, regular additions of compost help to further regulate it. Nitrogen becomes really important because it is the #1 nutrient needed by vegetables. There's a direct correlation of vegetable growth and nitrogen supply that encourages leaf growth. So sources of nitrogen include blood meal, fish meal, or pelleted chicken manure that release nitrogen the fastest. Phosphorus is required for root development and formation and maturation of fruits and tubers. It's regulated with consistent applications of compost and manure. It doesn't move through soil well, so accumulation is an issue. You want loose, not compacted soils for best results. Potassium. This allows root vegetables to keep longer and affects their size, taste, and color. Most plants become more resistant to disease when they have appropriate levels of potassium. This is not mineralized by organic matter. It's already present in soil in clays, especially micas, for example. It's very mobile in soil, so it's prone to leaching. Mica or basalt are usually additions that will gradually correct potassium deficiency. Calcium and secondary nutrients become very important. Calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are all secondary nutrients that play important roles in vegetable growth and are usually abundant enough in healthy soils to meet crop needs, but you should still test for them in your first time around at a site. So micronutrients are essentially trace elements that are essential to crops, but in tiny amounts. So it's just one of those things that if it's off, since the plant only needs a small amount of it, that deficiency can throw off a lot of other things. So we want to make sure that we are still looking via crop scouting for deficiency signs. And here is a great figure that essentially indicates colors that are representative of various deficiencies, but you might have to actually look up deficiency symptoms for each individual plant because sometimes they can vary. Good compost is the best ingredient to maintain healthy soil. So this is basically decomposition of carbonaceous organic detritus like straw and leaves, etc., and nitrogenous material like manure and crop residue, and organisms that reorganize and mix the organic matter to create this magic material called compost. Willest thou composteth and feed thy soil that feeds thyself? So, thank you for the laugh. So, the role of compost is to stabilize nitrogen and produces an amendment that releases nutrients gradually over time. It's a nitrogen storehouse, okay? And so it kills potentially pathogenic agents and weed seeds that lurk in animal manure. It creates active soil life, fungi, bacteria, earthworms, etc., which transfers to the garden and then they colonize it. It eliminates clumps, which results in light, homogeneous soil. It makes the world go round. I just like to compost. Composting is my favorite. Make compost, not war. Look at the cute koala. All right, so relying on natural fertilizers and why this is important. Natural fertilizers usually use nutrients in the form that's most readily available to plants. So this ensures that plants will have necessary nutrients in the early stages of growth, even in cold spring soils. So here's some examples of more natural fertilizer. I will also say that recent studies have shown that some of the main sources of synthetic fertilizer that we use actually kill off mass quantities of biological organisms in soils, and that's really, 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 really bad. So that was an unfortunate finding. So you want to make sure you establish your crop rotation, which allows soils to keep producing without being drained of nutrients, while also eliminating a number of diseases and harmful insects. This can occur when one species is continuously cropped. Plants with different root systems penetrate the soil to different depths. Plants with different nutrient requirements don't deplete the soil, that kind of thing. So the market gardener essentially developed a 10-year rotation where certain families of crops are not grown in the same spot within 4 years. They have heavy feeders followed by light feeders to sprout compost. They have root vegetables alternated with leaf vegetables, and they have crops that are easily weeded that are grown the year before onions that are difficult. So here's kind of what their crazy 10-year growth plan looks like. It's pretty extensive. This would take a lot of time to make. I'm going to skip this slide. You can come back and look at it in more detail, but I would just use what they made. Green manure and cover crops. Green manure are crops grown to add nutrients and organic matter to the soil. So using grasses and legumes are great for this. They're mowed down and then incorporated. They're chosen because they capture nitrogen in the air and they feed it to the soil, called nitrogen fixation. Yay, legumes. So they're a low maintenance compost option, but they do take up growing space. So adding supplementary nitrogen. You want to mix in green manure just before it flowers. Plant has the maximum amount of nitrogen stored at this stage. So it's a good idea to inoculate the legume seeds that you plant to promote rhizobium to grow, because the whole idea behind plants fixing nitrogen is based on their relationship with rhizobium in the soil. So you want to make sure you inoculate to make sure there's enough of that there. Adding organic matter, as a part of green manuring leaves little stable organic matter, so having plants with fibrous root systems are ideal. So some examples include fall rye or sorghum Sudan grass, which is what we saw at Constant Canopy's operation. That's what the chickens were feeding on in between the rows of sweet corn. Plants that produce a lot of biomass while improving soil structure, and cover crops. So you can kind of see the root systems here between a taproot and a fibrous root system. I know I'm going over time, so I'm trying to quickly go through these last few slides. You want to reduce the spread of weeds, so growing grasses over long periods to help to interrupt weed cycles. Buckwheat is the best thing ever for soil. Grow it wherever you can. Next year I plan on doing a buckwheat cover crop and I can't even wait. So this is a good mid-cycle cover to suffocate weeds. And letting a plot rest, aka letting it go fallow. Instead of growing vegetables for a season, seed a long growing cover to let the plot rest without frequent disturbances, like a white clover and cereal mix is a great example.